Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Today is November 3rd, 2020. As always, we appreciate your participation. If you want to be notified about events like this one from NEMSIS, please go to the nemsis.org website. In the upper right-hand corner, you will see a button to sign up for our mailing list. Today's presentation will be recorded, so you can see this at a later date and review the information. Today's presentation, State Dataset Training for Collect Data Software Developers, is going to be presented by Joshua Legler. Joshua, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let me get the screen sharing switched around here. My name is Josh Legler, and I'll be presenting the training today. We get turn on my video for just a little bit so you can see me for a second here. Today's training topic is on how the software developers of collect data software, in other words, local agency EPCR systems, can utilize the state data set that's provided by states to help ease the configuration and setup tasks and burden for their customer agencies. So this training is really targeted towards developers of collect data software systems. However, those of you who are state data managers or developers of state level systems, etc., are certainly welcome to listen in and maybe learn a few things during the course of this presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So State Dataset joins two other datasets in the NEMSIS standard. DEM Dataset and EMS Dataset are the ones that everyone is the most familiar with because they've been around for years and years. So DEM Dataset is sent by an agency to their state or to other places to provide information about the agency and its resources. And EMS Dataset, the one that flows most commonly on a daily basis, represents the EMS events that an agency is responding to. In other words, the patient care reports. And those patient care reports are sent by the agency to the state and certainly to other places as well, like HIEs or billers. State Dataset goes the other direction. State Dataset contains information about a state, and that information is provided by the state, and that information flows to the agency. The purpose of State Dataset is to provide information that an agency can use to initially set up and configure their local software that they're using. So State Dataset flows the opposite direction conceptually compared to DEM Dataset and EMS Dataset. So today we're going to talk about how the developers of collect data software systems can utilize that state dataset data to help their agencies configure their software correctly. And the end result is then when they submit DEM dataset and EMS dataset records to the state, they're going to be compliant with the constraints that the state has set. They're going to contain content that the state would expect. So there are two technical resources. I'm going to take you back to these links at the end of the presentation today as well, but wanted to make you aware of them up front. In the nemsis.org website, under the Technical Resources menu, if you go to the Data Dictionaries and XSD page, you'll find a link that is titled State Dataset File Software Developer Technical Guide. So that's a useful link for you as software developers. That's also useful for developers of state-level systems as well. I will make one note, which is that we neglected to update this for NEMSIS 3.5. So the language in this document is still focused on NEMSIS 3.4. So we need to make some updates there. The second resource that I'll point you to is if you go to the Technical Resources menu and then the Resource Repository, you'll see a link to the Resource Repositories Guide. This will give you instructions, guidance, tips, etc., on how to utilize the Git repositories that hold all of the state data sets that states have submitted and published through NEMSIS. And you can automate your monitoring and processing of those Git repositories. So we'll come back to these links at the end of the presentation. All right, so what's the problem we're trying to solve with StateDataSet? Well, here's one example. Let's say I've made my, my little ePCR product here. Don't worry, this doesn't actually work. I'm not going to go into business making ePCR products and compete with all of you. This is just a mock-up here of my Acme PCR system where I've created this agency setup section that an agency can go through when they're first setting up their software. And in this example, this is the page where they're going to select the medications that they carry on their EMS units. Well, without StateDataSet, then we either get a very long list of 100,000 medications, or maybe you provide a search box and people can start searching. Even when they search for something, they're going to get tons of results that match their search. And they just kind of start from scratch, picking through RX norm codes and labels and trying to identify which medications their agency carries at the various levels. All right, the problem we're trying to solve is that with the StateDataSet, we can do something like this, where out of the box, my ePCR product knows what state this agency is working in, and it has grabbed the StateDataSet for that state, and it has pre-filled the medications that the state permits agencies to carry at the various levels. And so these are the medications that the state recognizes. And then from there, we do recognize that the agency may have some customizations to make. Maybe they don't carry all of these medications that the state permits, so they uncheck a few of them. Maybe they carry a handful of medications that are not on the state list, but they've been granted some sort of permission to carry those medications in their agency, and they would need to add those. But this gives them the starting point and gets them set up, right from the get-go with something they can work with. All right, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to walk through each section of a StateDataSet file and point out the things to be aware of in that section and how you might utilize the information in that section in your collect data software system to pre-configure things like this for your agencies. And so the process I'll use here is I'm going to show a little bit of XML code from the StateDataSet, along with some kind of tips and things to be aware of. And then I'll follow that with a screenshot from my fake ePCR product here, how that might be utilized. First, we'll start with just a couple top level things. The StateDataSet file starts with an element called StateDataSet. That's the document element of these documents. And the StateDataSet has two attributes that are worth noting. One is the timestamp, and the other is the effective date. The timestamp indicates when this StateDataSet was created or last modified. And the effective date indicates when the information in this StateDataSet should go into effect within the state. The effective date was added in NEMSIS 3.5 and did not exist in 3.4. So you can use the timestamp just to make sure that you're processing the latest update of a StateDataSet from a state. You can compare that to what you've previously processed and say, yeah, this is a newer StateDataSet. I'm going to go ahead and process this. You could use the effective date to know when to deploy the changes. So the state may, for example, add some new custom elements, and they'll set an effective date on their StateDataSet that they want those custom elements or whatever else they added to be implemented by a certain date. Okay, and then the second section that I'll point out here is the SState section, which is very simple. It has one element, sstate.01, and this is a mandatory element, and this will contain the ANSI code for the state that this data is for. So in this case, this is representing the state of Mississippi. And of course, you can use that to make sure that you're processing a StateDataSet for the state that your agency actually serves. And keep in mind that an agency may serve multiple states. So you may need to process StateDatasets from multiple states to help that agency set up, for example, things like their facility list. Okay, so that's kind of the top level stuff in a state data set. And now we get into the meat of things. The first section is the custom elements. You'll see a section called SE custom configuration that will contain any EMS data set custom elements that a state has defined and wants to be implemented statewide. You'll also see an SD custom configuration for any demographic data elements that a state has defined and wants implemented system-wide. So process the information in these custom element configurations to set up custom elements within your system. Once you've created those elements in your system, you probably have some further work to do to actually decide where they're going to be in the data entry forms, how they're going to show up in the UI, all of that. So it's not completely automated, but at least you've got the setup and the definition. I would encourage you or point out that as you store these custom element configurations, the identifier can be the custom element ID. However, you want to combine that with an identifier for the state. Two different states could create a custom element that have the same custom element ID as each other, but somehow define the element a little differently. So I would say that each custom element definition should be treated as being unique to that state and should be keyed that way. Okay, so then when you export data to the state, what you can do is you can verify that the data that you export, you'll export an E custom configuration section in your EMS data set. You'll export a D custom configuration section in your demographic data. And you can verify that the custom configuration stuff that you export is an exact match to the SE custom configuration and SD custom configuration block provided in the state data set. If your output matches the state's custom configuration, then you've implemented correctly. All right, so here's an example. Here's my agency setup in my EPCR system. I've got a place here called custom data where I tell the agency, hey, these are the custom elements that are collected statewide within your state. So we've turned them all on. They're going to be in your data entry form unless there's some exception, some reason that you should turn them off, then you might do so. Otherwise, the agency gets these turned on. Different software products will have different ways of managing custom elements, so they won't necessarily be in a page just like this, where it's just custom data and a list of elements. But this portrays the idea. Okay, so let's go to the next section, which is state collected elements. This is in an element called S element, or a group called S element. You'll see a bunch of S element .01. And each instance of that will have the NEMSIS tag of an element, like erecord.0123, et cetera. Demographic data elements as well, dagency.0124, et cetera. So this is the list of data elements that the state collects. I will point out that this is usually viewed more as a legal requirement than a technical requirement. What I mean is the state, by having an element on their list, is telling the agencies that they should have that data element available in their data entry form. It should be turned on, it should be exported when it's collected. It does not necessarily mean that that element would be collected on every single record. The state will use schematron validation rules to implement any constraints that they have in that area. So the idea here is if the element is on the state list, it should be in the data entry form, should be turned on, should be available for collection by the people filling out reports. So you can process this list to make sure that all of the elements that the state has listed are in fact available in your data entry forms. You could even go further if you want. You could add some visual cues in your user interface for elements that are state elements versus the elements that an agency may have just turned on optionally. So let's look at how that might look. In my EPCR setup here, This is an example of maybe an ePCR system where the vendor manages the data entry form, has pre-designed it, has a spot selected for every data element where it's going to appear. And so as an agency user or agency administrator, I can go to this page of my ePCR product. It tells me, hey, we've already turned on all the data elements that your state requests. And so, for example, here, the state does not request standby purpose, but it requests all these other elements. Those are all turned on in your data entry form. Now, from here, you might turn on additional elements that you want. So if you want to collect standby purpose for local levels, for local reasons, go ahead and turn it on. Or if there's some reason that an agency would not collect a particular data element that is collected by the state, you'd give them the ability to make that overriding decision. But out of the box, they get the elements that the state is asking for. Now, some software products will have a different approach to this. Some products allow their agencies to design their own data entry forms. So they can just build a form from scratch and place all of their elements on it, decide what order they're going to be in. And so in that sort of a system, then the software developer could create a way that allows the EMS agency administrator to verify that all of the elements on the state list were in fact placed on their data entry form and are available for use. Okay, next we're going to look at certification or licensure levels. These are all the licensure levels that the state recognizes. So typically the states are actually issuing licenses to EMS providers at the various levels, EMT, AEMT, paramedic, EMR, etc. And there are other levels that the state may not recognize. Maybe the state doesn't do an EMR certification or license. So the state will provide the list of levels that that state recognizes. And those will be in sconfiguration.01. In this example here, this state recognizes AEMT, EMR, EMT, and paramedic. That's what those 4 codes represent. You can use the data in this list to restrict the list of values for licensure-related data elements in your ePCR system. There are many licensure-related data elements, and some of them do not use the same actual values, these 9917 values, as sconfiguration.01. But the translation is straightforward between them. So, for example, where you're collecting information about the agency's level of service, well, their level of service should be something that's actually recognized by the state. So in this example, we would not allow them to choose EMT paramedic because they don't recognize EMT paramedic. They recognize the 2009 paramedic licensure level. EMS personnel licensure level would be another element that would be driven by this or filtered by it. And then in the patient care report, the crew member level would be an element that would be affected by this configuration. So here's an example. In my setup, in my ePCR system, I go to the licensure levels tab, and I've told the agency, these are the levels recognized by your state. These are the ones that are active in the system. Now from here, the agency may say, okay, that's great. The state recognizes all these levels, but we don't actually employ any AEMTs in our agency. So we could turn that level off, even though the state would allow it. So the agency could further customize here, but they've got a starting point. Next, let's look at procedures and medications. This is an area of lots of work for agencies if you don't help them with it. I've shown the XML code here, sconfiguration.procedure group. sconfiguration.02 will have a licensure level. So this is the one for EMR. And then it'll be followed by one or more instances of sconfiguration.03, which will contain a SNOMED code for a procedure that EMRs, in this case, are permitted to do in that state. And then in medication group, same thing, S configuration 04 will contain the code for a licensure level. And then S configuration.05 will contain a list of primarily RX norm codes that represent medications that the state allows that level to do. The code type attribute was introduced in NEMSIS 3.5 because there are a handful of SNOMED procedure codes that can actually be recorded as medications. They have to do with blood product administration. So a few of the codes on this list may in fact be SNOMED codes, and they would have a different code type value. So the way you want to use this is, as I showed up at the beginning, you can restrict the list of allowed procedures and medications by licensure level to the list that was provided by the state. And then the agency may further whittle it down from there. So for example, the state may allow multiple pain relief medications at a certain level. The agency may only carry one or two of those pain medications. So the agency would turn off the ones that they don't use, even though the state allows or permits those medications. And so when you export agency demographic data, you'll have a deconfiguration.procedure group and deconfiguration.medication group, where you will send data to the state, telling the state which medications and which procedures the agency uses. And that is primarily going to be a subset of the procedures and medications that are listed in the state data set, and will represent the ones that the agency actually carries or performs. As always, there may be exceptions where an EMS agency has been granted permission by the state to carry or perform a procedure or medication that's not normally permitted by the state for that license level. And so it's important to continue to provide the ability for an agency to add medications or procedures beyond what the state has configured, but that should be kind of an extra step. So out of the box, they get what the state has provided as their starting point. And that was the example I showed at the beginning. Here's the medication list. Your state permits these medications. We've already selected all the ones that can be done at each level. Now from here, at the agency level, I can say, yeah, that's great, except I don't carry diltiazem. So I could uncheck the boxes for diltiazem, but I've got that starting point. Next is protocols. You'll get a list of protocols that the state permits in S configuration.06. That element will repeat for each protocol. And then all you gotta do is, just like all the others, you restrict the list of protocols for the agency based on the protocols that the state recognizes. I will point out that this is the area of state data sets that are typically, that the fewest number of states will provide. Many states do not regulate which protocols an agency can have, so the agency would just select from the full list. But some states do regulate that and say these are the protocols statewide, pick from these. So in your demographic data exports, you'll have deconfiguration.10, which is a list of EMS agency protocols, which should essentially be a subset of the values that are allowed in the state data set. So the state allows this 100 protocols. Out of those 100 protocols, the agency uses this list of 92 protocols. So that's what you're telling the state when you send demographic data to them. And again, there may be exceptions where an agency has a protocol that is not normally recognized by the state. So my setup page would look like this. Here's all the protocols. We've already pre-selected the protocols that the state recognizes. And then from there, as an agency administrator, I could say, well, yeah, the state recognizes the RSI protocol, but we don't do RSI in our agency, so I can uncheck the RSI protocol. Or even though the state does not recognize the airway sedation assisted protocol, we've been given some exception to perform that protocol. So we're going to turn it on. But they've got that base starting point that's based on what the state provided. Okay, the next to last section is the EMS agency list. This will be an S agency. It'll have repeating instances of S agency group, and S agency group will have 3 data elements in it: S agency.0, 1, 2, and 3, representing the state issued ID for the agency number, and the agency name. And that'll be the list of all of the agencies in the state. So typically, that means the list of agencies that have been licensed by the state EMS office or somehow recognized or registered by the state EMS office. Okay, so you can use this, number one, to help your customer know what their own agency number and name are. But that's usually not too difficult. They usually know that information. So where this is more useful, perhaps, is in helping your customer agencies to set up lists for the eScene.responder group section, where they can list other agencies on the scene of a call. That's where this information about other agencies can be really helpful to them. This should also populate selection lists for edisposition. Oops, I spelled that wrong. edisposition.destination group, destination/transferred to. So for agencies that transfer care to other EMS agencies, they should be indicating which agency they transferred care to, and they should be able to select that agency from this list here. Okay, so let's look at how that might be set up in an EPCR system. So I'm in my setup page again. For the other agencies section, I see the ID number and name of all the agencies in my state. And then I could check which ones are the ones that I work with. In fact, I probably should have put 2 columns of checkboxes here. One for other agencies on scene, and the other for destination/transferred to, agencies that I may transfer care to. And so then I can look through the list and say, yeah, I work with this ARAVAC life team and this other ARAVAC life team, so I might transfer care to them. I might also list them as other agencies on scene on my calls. So I can go through and just check the boxes. Then when people are filling out patient care reports, when they get to the scene section, they have a drop-down menu to choose from for other agencies on scene. And when they get to the destination or transferred to section, they have some other agencies, transporter agencies showing up to choose from. Okay, finally, we have the facilities list. This is in S facility. There will be an S facility group for each facility type. So S facility.01 will contain the facility type, which in this case is hospital. And then there will be multiple instances potentially of S facility.facility group, which will contain details about a specific facility that is of that type. So Pioneer Community Hospital of Aberdeen is a hospital. And then we've got their ID number, their hospital designations, their NPIs, their street address, contact info, GPS, USNG coordinates, telephone number, all of that. So this is information that you can use to help your agencies set up the facilities that they either pick up patients from or transport to. When you export demographic data to the state, it should contain a list of facilities that the agency works with. That list should essentially be a subset of the facilities that are in the state's master list. So the state will provide a list of all their facilities statewide. They might have 50 hospitals around the state, plus other types of facilities. But the agency, your customer, they work with, say, 5 or 10 of those 50 hospitals. They either pick up patients there or they transport them to there. So when you export demographic data to the state, you should be telling the state which facilities your agency, the customer of yours, works with. So it's going to be that subset of all the facilities that the state might recognize. And then Of course, these would fill drop-down lists for both eScene and eDisposition sections of the patient care reports. And again, as with all the others, the local agency demographic data may contain additional facilities beyond those recognized by the state, but facility information for state-recognized facilities should match what's in the state data set. The name, the number, the address, all of that should be the same. So an example where an agency might have a facility that's not recognized by the state. Well, for example, here in the state of Oregon, the state only manages the hospital list. So the agencies may go to other facilities that are not hospitals, and they just set those facilities up locally and add them to their list. But when they add a hospital to the list, we want them to use the exact information that the state has provided for the hospitals. Okay, so here's my ePCR setup again in my ePCR system, where this list of facilities has been pre-filled from the state data set. And now as an agency administrator, I can go through and I can just check the boxes for the facilities where I might pick up patients and for the facilities where I might transport patients. And then I've selected my handful of facilities that I work with out of this master list that the state has provided. Okay, before I get to the last two slides, which are just going to be about handling updates and then pointing you back to the technical guides, I'd like to take the opportunity to stop here for any questions or discussion on how you might utilize the information in a state data set to help your customers set up their local agency software. So open up for questions now. I'll monitor the chat, but you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions or comment. Okay, so sounds pretty quiet so far. So I'll jump in with a question myself. For those of you who do develop local software products, it looks like we do have several of you on the call. I wonder if you would mind sharing what you've done with State DataSet so far in NEMSIS 3.4 and maybe things that you've been looking at as you implement NEMSIS 3.5. So anyone who would be willing to share a little bit, I know, some of the stuff you're doing you might consider to be secret sauce features, I guess, of your product, but some general descriptions of how you're using it or looking to use it would be great to share with everyone, as well as any kind of challenges that you're trying to figure out how to overcome. Let's see, Caitlin, looks like you raised your hand.
Yes, sir. Yeah, so I could answer that. We had to write importers for the medication list and the procedure list so that a new agency can immediately spin up with what the state has approved in those cases. And those are all straightforward. But for any other developers in the call, I want you to know that it's not just you, you're not crazy. The state facilities lists are an ongoing, perpetual headache. Mm-hmm. And we are still kind of arguing about the best way to deal with picking up changes that come down from the state and merging them together with local only, non-state records that the agency may be creating for places that aren't in the state's list, and trying to automate that process without overriding important data. And that's actually a pretty hard problem because you're trying to match up free-form text fields like free-form text name and free-form street address where if it's even off by a few characters, then you have a lot of difficulty matching it up to the state list.
Excuse me. I'm going to be just pulling out here.
And Francis, looks like you're unmuted. Let's see if we can. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so it sounds, Caitlin, it sounds like the challenges are as a state updates their facility list, and maybe they change the address of a facility, or they make those modifications to existing facilities, or they add a new facility to their list, but your agency had previously already added that at the local level, things like that.
That's right, and not to mention the need to reconcile the state facility codes, because sometimes you might have dispatchers who they type a few characters, they don't find the matching entry in the state list, so they go and they create their own record, which doesn't have a code in it, because it was in the state list under some slightly different name or something. And then later on having to go and detect that has happened, because transports to and from this homemade facility, it doesn't have the right code attached to it. And if you put the right code, well, now the name and address don't match what's on file at the state, and you get schematron errors there too.
Yeah.
And we have been banging our head on this problem for years and still don't really have a satisfying solution to all the data mismatches that can occur between dispatchers making records and states publishing out updates and checking for name and address and code matches in their schematrons.
Yeah, right. It gets tough as those changes happen. I think the one thing I would offer off the top of my head is to track the source of a particular record. So if the source was the state, then you know that when the state publishes an update, you can go ahead and update that. If it was an address that changed, or a new hospital designation that a hospital got or something, you'll know that the record originally came from the state. You can go ahead and update it and make those changes, versus a record that originally was created by the local agency that's kind of seen as, I guess you could say, an orphan. It didn't come from the state. And so then later, when a state adds a facility to their list that happens to match what that agency had already put in, that's where you've got the challenge of then merging the agency information into that official state sourced records, so that in the future you can apply updates as they come from the state.
That's not a bad idea.
Okay. Yeah, as I review demographic data from agencies, the facility list is likely to be messy. I see a lot of messiness there. Some products way worse than other products. So clearly vendors are dealing with the facility list using different methods from each other, and some of those methods, from my perspective, are more effective than others. But I do see a lot of messiness there in the facility lists. And I usually spend a lot of time with local agencies helping them to clean up those facility lists. And then the medication and procedure lists are also my big area where I see a bunch of codes that come in. And frankly, what I see a lot of the time is I'll see 100 medications on the list for EMRs in an agency, which is clearly not correct. It should be like 3 or 4 or 5 medications. And so the agency has to go from there and uncheck all those medications that EMRs don't do to get things configured correctly. I see that a lot.
Roger that.
Let's see, there were a couple questions. So one from Francis in the chat. It seems many states are maintaining agency and facility lists in separate spreadsheets, et cetera. Yeah, that happens. And the NEMSIS TAC has staff who work with the state data managers to help them to standardize these lists, to get them copied into a state data set. When they're in a state data set, then they're in XML format. It can be validated. We can know that string lengths are correct, things like that. And then it's easier for all of you to process because it's the same format for every state. So NEMSA staff does work with state data managers to help them migrate those lists. And I think as you run into particular states where you still see that happening, you're certainly welcome to reach out to the NEMSIS TAC. Monet is the person who works directly with the state data managers, and she would be happy, I think, to hear from you and to reach out to a specific state to help them to standardize those lists.
I agree. I would be happy.
Oh, good. You're on the call. Oh, there you are, right up at the top of the list, and I didn't even see you. Thanks, Monet. Okay, and then a question from Kevin Ketcher. Should S facility have the same UUID as D facility? No, in fact, you'll note that in S facility, let me get to that, there are no UUIDs. So the UUIDs, and we talked about this when we were speccing this out for NEMSIS 3.5. The UUIDs are used only when the agency transmits data to the state, so the state can recognize that an agency is making a change or adding a facility to their demographic data. We talked about even bringing those UUIDs into the EMS data set. So in the destination that they transported to, that we would have the UUID of that facility in addition to the code and name and street address. And we did also talk about whether the UUID should be actually generated by the state for these facilities, and that local systems should import the facilities and use the UUID. And I'd have to go back to my notes as to the various reasons that we had for not taking that approach. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know that there were some reasons, both business side and technical side, that we ended up not putting UUIDs into the state data set. Sorry, I don't have a more complete answer for you there, but other than to say they're not there. Okay. Other software developers, experiences that you've had so far with utilizing state data set to help your agencies set up their software? Okay, well, feel free to chime in over the next few minutes as we wrap up. I want to talk a little bit about updates. So you can watch the Git repository for updates. You can automate this using your software platform. So you can just be watching that Git repository. The Git repository is the Atlassian Bitbucket product. It was formerly called Stash. And it has a REST API that you can use. So you can just hit that REST API and ask for the most recent commit timestamp. You could hit that on a daily or weekly basis, whatever, and then just compare that timestamp to what you've got from last time you processed state data set. And then you can also use diffs, and you can use the commit notes to identify what changed in a state data set. Monet helps the state data managers with the commit notes. So that is something that I think we've seen beefed up over the past couple of years. In the very beginning, commit notes were really sparse, and now I think the commit notes are tending to contain more detail about the changes that a state made, kind of from the business perspective, saying, hey, we added these facilities, we added this medication, that kind of stuff. So the diff and the commit notes allow you to identify what's changed in the files. And then you could process that and then implement a way within your system to notify your customers of changes so they can incorporate them as applicable to their local agency. So for example, maybe the state puts out an update to their state data set, and a medication got added to the paramedic medication list. So you could notify your customers and say, if you have paramedics, then you might want to note that XYZ medication is now permitted by your state for paramedics. And if your agency uses that medication, then click here to activate that medication for paramedics in your agency. Something like that. Or at a minimum, your state data set has been updated, new medications were added. Please go to the medications page to make sure that you're carrying all the medications that the state allows or that your agency has. Something along those lines. So that would be the updates. Okay, finally, back to the technical guides. So nemsys.org, technical resources menu, data dictionaries and XSD. Let's go ahead and head over to that page. Okay, and you'll see in the additional documents section, the software developer technical guide for StateDataSet. One of those overlooked documents that you might want to take a look at. Technically, it's also down here for 3.4. This has not been updated for 3.5 yet, so both versions of that guide today are the exact same document. We'll get some updates made to the 3.5, to the guide for 3.5. And you'll see that this guide really walks through what I walked through today in the training. Has some general guidance, and then you can see, oh, sorry, I've got some background noise here. You can see that it walks through each of these sections that I walked through today, like custom data elements, all the way through facilities. Okay, so then the other technical resource that I wanted to point out was in the resource repository page. And it's the resource repositories guide. So this guide tells you how the NEMSIS Git repositories are structured. So within the NEMSIS states project, each repository has a certain folder and file architecture to it. So state data set will always be in the same place. And talks about how NEMSIS utilizes the branches and tags within their workflow for updating resources. And then it goes through the various methods of accessing the repository through the Atlassian Stash or Bitbucket UI, through Git, any Git client that you'd like to use, and through a REST web service that's provided by Atlassian. So that's helpful for figuring out how you're going to get and process updates and changes. Okay, with that, I'll wrap up and open it up for any additional questions that you all might have on this topic.
Hi, this is Anne in Arizona. I kind of have a question. Because I maintain two lists. I have a public list in Excel for facilities that I have on our public website, and then I usually remember to ask it to be updated on the NEMSIS website. And then I do maintain our facilities list in the DataSet, the State DataSet Manager, although I usually have to ask Monet how to do it each time, I forget. But I was wondering, do most vendors have an established process when the state data set is updated on the NEMSIS site, when there's new facilities, because most of our updates are going to be new facilities that are added or new hospitals that have opened, where the vendor makes sure that the agencies, their clients know that there's a new list and new destinations, and then also that those agencies know that they need to and how to add, destinations that they interact with. Because I've seen a lot of the errors I see in my state are ones where someone keeps sending in the wrong destination code and it continues to happen. And I just didn't know if it was kind of a best practice, and kind of the same question with schematrons when we put out a new schematron and post it. And I'll email all the agencies and vendors too, but I know some vendors have agencies do it themselves with the update of the schematron, which generally includes the facilities list. And some of them, they do it for them. And it becomes very confusing as a state, at least for me, to know if I should be emailing the agencies directly, because a lot of them don't know what I'm talking about. But if I just email the vendors, sometimes I'm concerned I get an agency that will say, oh, we didn't know we need to update our schematron, or a vendor will email an agency and I'll be on the string saying you need to update your schematron. And I thought there was kind of a process that would be in place, and I'm wondering if I was mistaken for both of those.
Yeah, good questions. And in a minute, I'll describe some differences in NEMSIS 3.5 compared to 3.4 that I probably should have incorporated into the presentation slides. But before I do that, if we look at NEMSIS 3.4, which is currently on the street, so those of you on the call who are software developers who represent vendors, could you chime in on Anne's question? What are you doing to watch these resources and to notify your customers when updates are made by states?
This is Samantha with DSO. We're very reliant on the resources update email that goes out. That's what we focus on. And we do, as a vendor, apply the schematron for all of our agencies, but we do not do the facilities. We let the agencies decide if that is a facility they work with. And we help point them into where the state manages all their things, but we don't notify them every time that updates.
Okay, thanks, Samantha. What are some of the rest of you doing in terms of notifying your customers of changes from states?
ImageTrend has an option to upload new schematrons, new facility list, and we also have the option that will send a message to our system administrators that those new resources are available, and they have the option to pull those resources down and manage that new resources on their own system.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Anyone else? Okay, let me talk a little bit about differences with 3.5. StateDataSet was introduced as an optional data set in NEMSIS 3.4, and it has gained good traction. We have state data sets from most of the states across the country now. In 3.5, StateDataSet becomes a mandatory component of the standard, and software is tested on its ability to use it. What that means for state-level systems, in other words, receive and process compliance, is that state-level systems will be tested on their ability to generate a state data set for a state. So in 3.4, we provided the NEMSIS state dataset builder on the NEMSIS website. You could use the state dataset builder as a standalone product to build and maintain your state dataset file if you're a state data manager. But in NEMSIS 3.5, that responsibility of generating that file will shift to your state reporting product. And the compliance testing process will verify their ability to correctly generate a state data set. So, and for state data managers like yourself, that's going to remove at least one step, if not two or more, from the process of maintaining your state data set. Because, for example, as soon as you add a facility to your state system, then you could just regenerate your state data set, and that new facility is now in there. As soon as you add a new agency or a new medication or procedure, just regenerate the state data set, and that data is then in there. Developers of collect data systems at the local agency level will have a little bit, they'll see state data set incorporated into their testing process for compliance testing as well. What they'll see is when they get the test cases, they'll get a state data set, and then they'll get the demographic test case, and the demographics test case for 3.5 is going to have all the information about the agency, but there's going to be some areas, for example, the custom elements, where the test case file will say this custom element configuration should come from the state data set. And then you fill out the custom results there. And as they get to the patient care report test cases, they'll see, for example, on destination information, it'll say that the destination was such and such place that's in the demographic data set, which says such and such place that's in the state data set. So, and then it won't provide them, for example, the street address and all of that information, because that was in the state data set and was pulled into demographic data set and then should pull into the patient care report data. So there's a little bit of that in the compliance test cases for 3.5. So it'll affect both state level systems and local level systems, beefing up this ability to really produce and utilize the state data set. Other questions? Let's see, another one from Anne in the chat. Should we be putting custom values for an established NEMSIS element as well as custom data elements in the state data set and also in the custom element library? Yes, your custom element configuration should go in your state data set if you want them implemented statewide, right? So you might have a bunch of custom elements in your state system that are just there for agencies that directly use your state system. They use them if they want. But you may have some custom elements that you want everyone in your state to collect. Those are the ones that should be in your state data set. And they may be standalone custom elements, or they may be a custom element that extends an existing NEMSIS element with some additional values or codes. So both of those would go in your state data set. Once those are published in your state data set, they automatically show up in the custom element library. The custom element library gets its data from all the state data sets. Okay, any other questions? We're just about at the top of the hour. Chris, I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for all the wonderful information, and thanks everyone for attending and your conversation. Got a lot of really good information today. I would encourage you, as always, if you think of something that you had a question about this information afterwards, go to the NEMSIS website and go to the contact information part of the website. We're happy to get information back out to you. This will be recorded. It will go on to YouTube. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and also subscribe and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So any of those will get you updates for more events that we hold like this one. Once again, thank you very much, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.